The decision was not made by generals in clean rooms. It was made by a ghost, knee-deep in frozen mud. 3,000 souls. That is the number history ignores. A subtraction error filed deep beneath the famous victories. It happened in the dead of winter. A landscape of white death and black iron. The year was 1945. The war was ending, but the dying was not. We speak of the final push, the great Allied surge toward the heart of the Reich. We speak of victory won, but victory always demands a price tag, printed in blood and forgotten in the celebration. This price was paid on the banks of the river Vistula. It was paid by Major Elias Thorn. Thorn was not a hero. He was just a man who had survived too many nights. His face was a roadmap of exhaustion, etched deep by gunpowder smoke and unrelenting fear. He commanded the remnants of the 51st Reconnaissance. They called them the Ghosts. They operated outside the main line, always moving, always freezing. They were supposed to be relieved. The cold was not merely weather. It was a weapon. It slipped beneath the wool and the canvas, finding the soft tissue, freezing the breath in the air. Thorn could taste the rust of the frozen air, mixed with the stale flavor of burnt cordite lingering from the skirmish 3 days prior. He sat in a makeshift bunker carved into the embankment. Above him, the snow fell, silent and unforgiving. The silence was the worst part. It meant the enemy was listening. It meant the enemy was close. Thorn ran a gloved thumb across the cracked screen of his map case. The map was useless. Everything had changed since dawn. The lines were fluid, collapsing and reforming hourly. But one point remained immutable: the bridge. The structure was known only as Bridge 402. It spanned a deep, narrow gorge, the last natural barrier before the open plains leading to the primary objective. It was ancient steel, battered but intact. And it was Thorn's nightmare. His radio operator, Private Miller, sat huddled beside the transceiver, adjusting the dials with ritualistic precision. The static hissed, an angry, low sound, the breath of the war machine. Then the static broke. The voice was thin, reedy, yet carrying the unmistakable weight of high command. General Patton's staff, miles away, insulated by warmth and certainty. Major Thorn, report status on Bridge 402. Thorn leaned closer. The smell of Miller's sweat was sharp, metallic. Bridge 402 secured, sir. Holding at the west abutment. Casualty rate acceptable, currently operating at 60% strength. Thorn lied easily. They were operating at 40%. Less. They had bled out in the trenches carved into the frozen earth. His men were ghosts in truth, starving, sleepless, running on pure, terrified adrenaline. The voice crackled back, faster now, tighter. The tone shifted from inquiry to command. Listen closely, Major. Operation Ironclad is moving up 2 days. The 1st and 3rd Armored are pushing hard. We need that crossing secure by 400 hours tomorrow. Do you understand? Ironclad depends on 402. Thorn swallowed the sudden dryness in his throat. Ironclad. The operation meant thousands of tanks, tens of thousands of men, the full crushing power of the Allied spearhead. They were relying on his handful of exhausted men to hold the door open. Understood, sir. We hold 402. Good. Now the new coordinates. Thorn felt a tightening in his chest, a cold dread colder than the Polish winter. He knew the coordinates before they were spoken. The general detailed the push. The armored divisions would use Bridge 402 to flank the main German defensive line, guaranteeing a swift breakthrough. But Thorn's location, the very position they had fought 3 brutal days to secure, suddenly became a liability. Major, your position is exposed. As soon as the armor crosses, your sector will be the primary target for the inevitable German counterflank maneuver. You are to hold the west abutment until the lead elements of Ironclad have crossed, roughly 0500 hours. Then, you are authorized to pull back to the designated rally point. Thorn gripped the radio handset, his knuckles white. Sir, the rally point is 15 miles back, through the Black Forest corridor. That route is impassable under heavy fire. The general's voice hardened, losing all courtesy. This was the voice of cold strategy. Major, this is not a negotiation. The priority is the bridge. Ironclad must not stop. Your objective is delaying action. Your unit will absorb the counterattack. You will buy the time. The silence that followed was thunderous. The general was ordering a sacrifice, not a desperate charge, but a slow, calculated execution. Thorn looked at the map again. He traced the route the armor would take. Triumph. He traced the route his men would take after 0500 hours. Massacre. The Germans were not stupid. They knew 402 was the choke point. They had retreated only to coil. Once they saw the armored divisions streaming across that bridge, they would hit Thorn's perimeter with everything they had. Artillery, panzers, infantry waves. They would erase the 51st Recon. If Thorn followed orders, the 51st was dead. They would be pinned against the river gorge, pulverized into the frozen earth. But if he did not follow orders, if he chose to retreat early, saving his men, the advancing columns of Ironclad would be caught mid-crossing, caught in the open, vulnerable to air attack and concentrated shelling, a traffic jam of tanks and men, ripe for annihilation. The cost of his survival would be counted in thousands, perhaps 10,000 lives lost. The entire thrust of the winter campaign stalled. He was the fuse. He could burn quickly and allow the main charge to detonate successfully, or he could snuff himself out and risk the entire operation blowing up in their faces. This was the impossible dilemma of the man on the ground. The mathematical genius of the General Staff had delivered a solution where 1,000 deaths prevented 10,000, but Thorn was looking at the faces of the 1,000. He stared across the trench line. The air vibrated with unspoken terror. His men were digging deeper into the frozen ground, hacking at the earth with pickaxes and bayonets. Every sound was muffled by the snow, making the work ghostly. Sergeant Finn, his second-in-command, approached, sliding into the bunker. Finn's face was raw, chapped by wind and fatigue. He didn't ask a question. He just waited for the bad news. "Orders, Major?" Finn's voice was rough sandpaper. Thorn did not look at him. He looked at the floor of the bunker, damp with meltwater and stained with old blood. "We hold 402, Sergeant, until 0500 hours. Finn understood immediately. The time was a death sentence. "That's after the crossing, Major. They'll flank us hard. They'll roll us up." Thorn felt the bitter chemical burn in his stomach. He nodded slowly. "They will. We have to buy the time." Finn looked away, focusing on the dark mouth of the trench above them. His shoulders slumped, weighted by the certainty of doom. He had 3 brothers back home. Thorn knew the details of every man's life. That knowledge was the true weight of command. "Sir," Finn said, his voice barely a whisper, "if we pull back at 0300, we can still clear the corridor before the counterattack peaks. We lose the bridge momentarily, but the armor can push through after the initial shelling. We save the company." Thorn felt the temptation clawing at him. The sheer overwhelming lure of self-preservation. Retreat now, save his men, give them the chance to see the spring. He could fabricate the timeline. He could report that the German attack came earlier, harder. Who would challenge the word of a frontline major buried under 40 miles of hostile territory? It would be a lie, a necessary, heroic lie. But the image flashed behind his eyes, the tanks of the 3rd Armored, packed tightly on the causeway leading to the bridge, suddenly halted by the lack of covering fire. The scream of Stukas overhead, the concentrated German artillery dialing in on the immobile metal targets, the burning flesh, the spilled oil, 10,000 men. Thorn took a deep breath, the cold air scraping his lungs. The smell of fear was thick now, not just from Miller or Finn, but from himself. He looked at Finn. He saw the trust, the expectation that Thorn would find the solution that did not involve wholesale slaughter. "No, Sergeant," Thorn said, the words heavy stones dropping into a deep well. "We hold until 0500, not a minute sooner. Dig in deeper. Find the deep rock. We will need it." Finn looked back at him, confusion mixing with horror. "Major, why?" "Because," Thorn whispered, staring at the map showing the entire Allied flank, "they are sending everything they have at us. If we break, the line breaks. This war stops here." He knew the truth was darker. The decision was already made, miles away, by men who viewed units as statistics. The 51st Reconnaissance had been designated expendable. Thorne's only choice was to accept the sacrificial role, to turn the slaughter into strategy. He looked down at his trembling hands. The hour was approaching midnight, 4 hours until the advance began, 5 hours until the execution. He reached for the bottle of cheap medicinal cognac tucked into his breast pocket. He needed the fire in his throat. He needed the momentary reprieve from the biting cold and the impending doom. He had just condemned 300 men to save 10,000 others, and he knew with chilling certainty that this moment, this calculation, this cold-blooded trade would never appear in the history books. It was just the cost of doing business. Outside, the snow stopped falling. The world grew unnaturally silent. Thorne knew that silence. It was the moment before the hammer falls. The Germans were coming, and they were coming for the ghosts. The cold did not bite. The cold consumed. It was a physical enemy, grinding the nerves of the men holding Hill 708. They had endured the night. 1,000 artillery shells had tried to scrape them from the frozen earth. They failed. Now exhaustion was the razor edge. Lieutenant Markov traced the crater lip, the fine grit of pulverized concrete stinging his eyes. He counted the living. 63 men, 63 souls left to stop an army. The air smelled like spent explosives and human waste. The wind carried a high-pitched whine, the sound of metal cooling too quickly. Markov pressed his face into the mud, ignoring the pain in his ribs. He felt the tremor before he saw the enemy. Not the shaking of shell fire, but the heavy, rhythmic thudding of engine blocks turning over miles away. The tanks were coming. The High Command had called this hill a sacrifice. They had traded these lives for a few hours of critical delay. Markov knew the arithmetic. It did not matter. He would not surrender the ground, not while his men still breathed the poisoned air. Sergeant Collard was beside him, his face a mask of grease and fatigue. Collard did not look at Markov. He looked at the horizon. He was searching for the exact moment of death. "They brought the heavy ones, Lieutenant," Collard whispered. His voice was desiccated, scraped raw by the smoke. Markov nodded. The scouting reports had been grim. The newly deployed Königsteiger units. Monsters of steel, impervious to their standard-issue 57mm guns. They had 2 anti-tank teams remaining, 2 chances to pierce the heart of the beast. The silence returned, a dreadful, anticipatory silence. Then the machine guns opened, not close but far off, a sweeping, synchronized chatter that meant the German infantry screen was already advancing. They moved like hunters, careful and relentless. Markov lifted his glasses. Dust kicked up on the flat plain below. The dust thickened, turning black. 8 columns, 8 roaring lines of steel moving toward the slope. The Königsteigers led the charge, their massive turret cannons aimed low, hungry for flesh. "Wait for the infantry," Markov hissed into the field telephone. His voice cracked with strain. "Don't waste the heavy ordnance." The waiting was agony. Every second stretched, thin and brittle. The trenches were shallow graves, carved by tired hands. The men shifted their rifles, their breath steaming in the frigid air. They felt the rhythm of the tanks now, a deep, chest-rattling pulse. Closer. The German infantry, the veteran grenadiers, materialized from the smoke haze. They were silent, focused. They walked forward as if reviewing their own funeral parade. "Now!" Markov screamed. The line erupted. Rifles barked. The anti-tank guns cracked, a sharp, hopeful sound cutting through the engine noise. Tracer rounds stitched the air. The first 57mm shell struck the lead Königsteiger. It glanced off the angled glacis plate with a meaningless clang. The impact sent sparks flying, nothing more. The tank did not slow. It did not flinch. It fired back. The blast was immediate, catastrophic. It hit the forward trench section, obliterating the anti-tank crew instantly. The sound ripped the oxygen from the air. A massive cloud of dirt and pulverized humanity rose high above the ridge. The men saw it. They saw the futility. Collard dropped a grenade into a nearby cluster of approaching grenadiers. The explosion was small, personal, swallowed quickly by the larger chaos. "Second gun!" Markov yelled, scrambling through the shattered earth toward the last anti-tank position. The second gunner, a young corporal named Dmitri, was sweating despite the cold. His hands trembled on the loading mechanism. "Aim for the turret ring, Dmitri. It's our only chance." Dmitri squeezed the trigger. The gun bucked violently. The shell flew straight, true. It struck the thin seam between the turret and the hull of the second Königsteiger. Impact. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a thin curl of smoke rose. Then the hatch blew outward, followed by thick black fire. A single cheer erupted from the shattered defenders. 1 tank down, 7 remained. The German response was swift, overwhelming. The remaining Königsteigers ignored the infantry battle and focused solely on eliminating the ridge. They moved their massive bulk up the slope, firing on the move. The third shell landed directly on the remaining anti-tank position. Dmitri and the gun ceased to exist. The line was gone. The pioneers were left with only their rifles, their light machine guns, and their desperation. They were fighting armored giants with nothing but grit. The first Königsteiger breached the perimeter wire, crushing the bodies of the dead into the mud. The machine gun mounted on its hull began to sweep the trenches, tearing through sandbags and flesh alike. The smell of hot grease and hot blood mixed in a sickening stew. Markov saw his platoon disintegrate. Men were trapped, cornered, unable to climb out without being cut in half. The German infantry followed the tanks, throwing stick grenades into the desperate dugouts. This was the end, the sacrifice. Markov dove behind a broken concrete slab, narrowly missing a burst of heavy machine gun fire. The noise was deafening. He reached for his last radio set, its casing cracked and filthy. "Command, this is 708. The anti-armor assets are destroyed. We are being overrun, requesting immediate air support." The answer was static, then a tired, calm voice, miles away, insulated by safety and distance. 708, you are confirmed holding the delay objective. Continue to fix the enemy units. Air assets are committed to the secondary target. Hold your position, Lieutenant. Hold your position. The order was a death warrant signed in ink. Markov looked out at the carnage. He saw Collard, rifle in hand, fighting a hand-to-hand battle against 2 grenadiers near a dugout entrance. He saw the cold, efficient murder of his men. They were dying for a delay that had already been accomplished. They were dying because the decision-makers prioritized steel over flesh. A sudden, sharp clarity pierced the fog of combat. The original order was flawed. To hold this ridge was suicide that gained nothing further. To retreat now meant the tanks would smash through the flank and cut off the entire main army supply line. There was only one way out, not defense, attack. Markov had 1 unit left, a small demolition squad of 5 men, hidden in the ravine on the northern flank, their original mission to destroy the bridge far behind enemy lines. A mission now irrelevant. He grabbed the nearest survivor, a shivering rifleman named Pyotr, and pulled him close. "Pyotr, go low. Find Sergeant Lykov in the north ravine. Tell him secondary plan enacted, not the bridge. Now hit the rear armor." Pyotr nodded, his eyes wide and terrified. He plunged into the smoke, crawling beneath the path of the relentless machine guns. Markov stood up, drawing his service pistol. He did not wait for the 5 men to arrive. He knew he had to draw the enemy's attention. He had to buy them 30 seconds of chaotic distraction. He ran toward the largest tank, the one whose engine roared loudest. He fired 3 useless shots from his pistol into the track housing. The tank paused, its massive turret beginning to traverse toward the foolish human. The German gunner would have found Markov easily. The shell would have vaporized him. But at that exact moment, Sergeant Collard finally defeated his assailants. Grabbing a captured German machine gun and spraying a concentrated burst of fire toward the tank commander's vision slits. The attention shifted. The Königsteiger fired a coaxial machine gun burst that stitched a line of dirt inches from Markov's feet. Markov felt the wind of the bullets. He kept running, buying time. Click, click, click. Then came the new sound. Not the deep roar of tank engines, but the short, sharp detonation of shaped charges. Thwump. The first blast hit the nearest Königsteiger on its engine deck, where the armor was thinnest. The massive tank shuddered, smoke billowing instantly from the explosion. Thwump. The second charge hit the tank directly behind it. This time the effect was devastating. The charge breached the thin rear armor, Secondary explosions erupted inside the hull. The tank's engine compartment became a pressurized furnace. Lykov's demolition team, 5 desperate, forgotten men, had executed the maneuver perfectly. They had used the terrain to flank the entire armored column, racing down the ravine under the cover of the initial assault, and struck the giants where they were most vulnerable. Chaos replaced order. The remaining German tanks, focused on the front, now had an invisible enemy at their backs. They began turning, their treads churning the frozen ground, trying to bring their heavy frontal armor to bear against the small, agile demolition team. This was the opportunity. This was the turning point. Markov knew they had a minute, perhaps less, before the tanks adjusted and neutralized the threat. He needed to strike while the enemy was blind and enraged. He grabbed a discarded crate of fragmentation grenades, his arms shaking with adrenaline. He shouted into the trench line, "Pioneers, now or never! We counterattack, drive them back!" The surviving men, seeing the impossible, seeing 2 of the steel monsters burn, found a final, reserves of fury. 63 men had become 40. Now 40 men surged from the trenches, not to defend, but to attack. It was a desperate, suicidal sprint. They bypassed the tanks, ignoring the main threat, and charged into the dense ranks of the German infantry, who were now trapped between the ridge and their own disorganized armor. The air filled with the frantic noise of close-quarters combat. Bayonets flashed. Rifles were used as clubs. It was primal, ugly, immediate. The Germans, accustomed to fighting defenders hiding in holes, were bewildered by the sudden, manic assault. Collard led the charge, a figure of unstoppable rage. He tore through the German line, creating a wedge of pure violence. Markov threw his last grenade toward a cluster of grenadiers attempting to regroup. The blast momentarily cleared the fog. Lykov's team, having disabled 4 of the 8 tanks, was now under heavy rifle fire. They were pinned down, unable to reload. The remaining 4 Königsteigers roared. They were beginning to orient themselves, their powerful main guns swinging back toward the ravine. The counterattack was failing. Markov saw the last anti-tank projectile, a salvaged Panzerfaust, lying near the ruined concrete slab where Dmitri had died. He ran for it. It weighed a ton. He hoisted it onto his shoulder, ignoring the searing pain in his muscles. He aimed at the closest tank, the one preparing to fire on Lykov's team. He braced, exhaled the taste of cordite and panic, and fired. The rocket screamed across the 50 yards, separating them. It struck the turret cheek, the strongest point of the tank, but the angle was perfect. The charge detonated, blinding the optics, fracturing the armor. The Königsteiger shuddered, its main cannon suddenly falling slack. Disabled but not destroyed. It was enough. The German armored advance broke. 4 tanks were burning wreckage. 1 was critically disabled. 3 remaining functional tanks, unable to risk being flanked again, unable to fire through their own infantry, and facing a pocket of unexpectedly ferocious resistance, began to retreat. The roar of the engines faded, replaced by the crackle of burning steel and the ragged, exhausted breathing of the men on the ridge. They had done it. They had held the line. Not by obeying the order to delay, but by choosing the reckless, heroic, unauthorized attack. Markov slumped against the crater wall, the bitter cold finally returning to claim his strength. He looked at the ridge. It was a ruin, a graveyard. The cost of the High Command's decision was scattered across the muddy slope, thousands of miles from the polished floor where the original order had been given. They had secured the day. But the price was permanent. The cost beyond measure. It was not peace, it was just the end of the sound. The silence was heavier than the bombardment had been. It pressed down on the few survivors, crushing the air from their lungs. The snow continued to fall, a steady, indifferent curtain trying to wash the red from the world. The colonel stood. He did not feel the cold anymore. He was past feeling. He was simply a mechanism, observing the wreckage his decision had wrought. The trench line was a cemetery. Men frozen mid-scream. Their faces were grey marble, their eyes wide open, reflecting a sky that offered no forgiveness. He walked the perimeter. His boots crunched on ice and spent casings. He stepped around a leg. He did not look back. The smell was absolute. Sulfur, frozen entrails, and the metallic tang of so much spilled life. It clung to his uniform, to his skin, to to the lining of his teeth. He would never wash it off. He reached the command bunker. It was hollowed out, its roof caved in like a cracked skull. He had to count them. He had to sign the final tally. The numbers swam. They were not numbers. They were names. Names of boys he had promised victory, or at least survival. He had delivered neither. He sat on a splintered crate. The radio operator, a pale, shaking boy who had survived 2 hours too long, began transmitting the report. The signal was weak. The words were clinical. Enemy contained. Objective secured. Personnel losses severe. The colonel watched the boy's lips move, mouthing the lies that high command demanded. Contained. They had bled out for a few hundred meters of frozen dirt. Secured. The price had bought them 3 days of breathing room, 3 days purchased with 1,000 lives. He pulled the map from his pocket. The ink was running, smeared by sweat and snowmelt. He traced the line, the critical, deadly pivot he had ordered. The one spot they had to hold, against all tactical sense. The one decision that broke the rulebook, driven by the desperation of a larger, failing campaign. It had worked. They survived the retreat. But the silence of this field screamed the true cost. He looked at his hands. They were caked in mud. They were the hands that signed the order. They felt alien now, heavy and unclean. He wanted to scream the truth into the radio, to denounce the necessity, to beg for release. But a commander does not beg. A commander stands by his decision, even when the decision hollows him out. He rose slowly. He had to consolidate the surviving units. 42 men, out of 1,200. 42 ghosts, shuffling in the growing gloom. He moved toward the nearest group. They watched him approach. Their eyes held no hate. Worse, they held pity. They knew. They understood that the man who survived the battle was often the one most utterly destroyed. "We move at dusk," he rasped. His voice was a dry, unused sound. "Northwest. Maintain contact with Group Beta." The men nodded lifelessly. They were carrying their wounded, wrapping the frozen bodies of their friends in torn canvas. The silence between them was an accusation. He turned away, walking back toward the ruins of the bunker. He needed to write the final addendum, the personal note for the historical file. He pulled out his pen. His fingers stiffened. What was there left to say? That the ground was indefensible, that the intelligence had been flawed, that the men fought like lions. They died for the plan. He wrote that down. The ink bled into the paper. The decision had been made in a bunker miles away, over steaming coffee and cigarettes, surrounded by crisp maps and the assurance of strategic necessity. Here, there was only freezing metal and the stench of defeat, regardless of the tactical success. This was where the necessity died and the humanity took over. He felt the tremors begin again. Deeper this time. Not just cold, but the deep, bone-shaking realization of his own terrible solitude. Command isolates. This kind of command destroys. A single runner arrived, struggling through the deep snow. He was young, his face terrified. "Colonel," he panted, snapping a desperate salute. "Message from Sector Command. Immediate return requested. For review of action." Richter looked at the boy. Review of action. That was the cold, sterile term for judgment. They needed a scapegoat. They needed a name to sign the historical report of failure, even if the failure was merely a consequence of their own grand strategy. The small decision, the necessary horror, would be filed under his responsibility. He handed the runner the map. "Tell them the line held. Tell them the cost is accounted for." He did not intend to go back. The moment he signed that final report, confirming the casualty count and justifying the pivot, his fate was sealed. He would become a political liability, an inconvenient truth. Better to vanish here, in the grey, cold oblivion of the front line. He stood near the shell hole that marked the exact location of the most intense fighting. The ground was still smoking faintly. He reached down, plunging his bare hand into the frozen soil. He grabbed a handful of mud and ice. He brought it to his face. It smelled of earth and ruin. He remembered the argument with his peers. It's suicide, Richter. They had warned him. You cannot hold that position. But the chain of command had tightened, relentless and unforgiving. The Eastern Front demands sacrifice, Colonel. Make the trade. He had made the trade. He looked up at the sky. It was dark now. The first stars were piercing the haze, cold needles of light. They looked down on the dead, uncaring. He felt a deep, profound sense of release. The burden of command was gone, replaced by the crushing weight of consequence. He was no longer a colonel making decisions. He was just a man, lost in the snow, standing on a mound of graves he had personally ordered dug. He reached into his tunic and pulled out a small, worn photograph. A woman, a smile he had not seen in 3 years. He did not look at it long. It belonged to a life that no longer existed. He tore it slowly, deliberately into 4 neat pieces, and let the wind take them. He did not turn toward the retreat. He walked the other way, deeper into the dark, toward the sound of distant, sporadic fighting. He needed to witness the very edge of the line, the place where the war still burned. He needed to see it clearly one last time, without the blinding lens of command responsibility. He wanted to feel the cold again, to feel something real, something physical, that was not the gnawing spiritual rot of guilt. He walked until the sounds of his retreating men were gone, until there was only the wind whistling through the shattered trees. The historians would look at the files decades later. They would examine the maps, the strategic decisions, the grand movements of armies across vast continents. They would analyze the success of the overall campaign, noting the crucial temporary stability achieved in the rear sector. They would find the report. They would find the numbers. 1,000 men, traded for 3 days. They would mark the decision as necessary, though tragically costly. They would never look at the terrain itself. They would never smell the copper and ash. They would never know the tremor in the colonel's hand as he signed the death warrant. They would never realize that the decision was not merely tactical, it was spiritual. It was the moment a man broke the sacred oath to protect his own, for the greater, cold, indifferent mechanism of the war. The war swallowed the small horrors whole. And the terrible truth is this: the most agonizing decisions, the ones that cost the most human life, are the ones that save the larger plan. They are the ones that work, and because they work, they are never questioned. They are merely filed away. The colonel's name became a footnote, associated with the high casualty rate of a minor, unnamed skirmish. His fate, and the true, brutal agony of that necessary sacrifice, was buried beneath the shifting snows of history. It is in these silences, in these forgotten fields, that the real cost of war is paid. Not in the grand victories, but in the small, terrible decisions that no one ever talks about. And for those who made them, there is no peace. Only the lasting biting cold.